Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today's June 18, 2025. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Please subscribe. Also want to thank John Jost for being the dinner guest at John Canizaro's party. That's where I met today's guest, Patrick Miller. Patrick, where are you calling in from?
Calling in from Queens, New York.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
What is the best thing for a human being? I give two things, good sex and then good food afterwards.
Oh my God. I haven't had good sex. I actually, in 40 years, maybe someone's implied it, but about 2 weeks ago, a guy goes, sex. And I was like, wow, that's a no-brainer. But good food after the good sex. But let me follow up. Is there such a thing as bad sex?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There definitely is. Yeah, you don't have chemistry with somebody; it just doesn't quite work out. Like all these, absolutely, it can be terrible. There's times I've thought I remember I sort of went years ago. Before I met my wife, I went on a celibate streak for a while because I just had spent all evening with somebody and ended up very late at night and had very bad sex. And I was like, you know what? I'm just not going to do that for a while.
Yeah. Beautiful. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
My favorite form of information, I would say probably visual, which is probably why I got into, filmmaking and
Yeah.
kind of visual mediums and things like that. Usually kind of seeing something that is illustrated in a way, if we're looking at it as, kind of montagey things, or just kind of trying to create some metaphor with, like, the image and these sorts of things. It's become definitely more profound for me in the last 15 years than I would say. So definitely visual would be my way of understanding information.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm a idiot raised in front of a TV, but basically wanted to be a reader, writer all my life and pretend to be. But it's like tutorials are so cool now. From 3 to 8 minutes, you just get it all, boom, and cute pictures. And, it's like, wow, the way tutorials are on YouTube now is amazing.
Yeah, and it's definitely been like how it's changed a lot about how I learn how to do stuff, and just like be able to just figure out, like, because I can read something and I can kind of somewhat figure out by my imagination what's supposed to be, or through a diagram. But seeing somebody just go, hey, you do this, this, and this, I go, oh, that's it. And it's like, one time, the one time I need to see it, and then that's it, I've got it. So
yeah. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Why do we collect or gather information? I would say we do it because I think a lot of us, like, we always want to be able to remember things about what we've done. The reason why I gathered it for a long time and still do is because it's always about, well, what can I do to understand, like, my experience a little bit better? Like, what came before me? What am I sort of seeing as trends that are coming up? And is there a way that I can begin to make sense of things? Because to me, the world doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And to me, I think grabbing those information and keeping that, I think that's why I think a lot of people do it, to try to make sense of things. And then if you're talking about, like, in the collecting of things, it's like that I don't know. Is it kind of like almost going back to, like, a very primal thing of, like, I have more rocks and stuff than you do, or whatever, or how people want to make, like, a sort of world that they want to inhabit. So you need all these things that help these accoutrements and things like that. So
yeah, very good, because you anticipated the next question. You got ESP. Is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate. I think people just we do it just as this weird primal need.
Yeah.
Maybe some of us don't. I'm sure there
Yeah.
are some people that are very present tense, and sometimes I'm envious of that. But
Yeah.
definitely, I say that it is just this instinctual thing, and you either go with that instinct or you don't. I was watching the Paul Rubens documentary the other day, and I wish there was a bit more about his house, because he was just a huge collector, all these like camp and kitsch things and all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, I can understand for the world he was trying to create. Totally made sense.
Totally wanted it big on my list to interview my whole career, and really I knew people who got invited to his parties, and just to go through his house and see his collection, because I have a friend who's went to Cal Arts with him, and he's a collector too. And you go in these houses and they got like every doll every made, and then they have a second one so that you have one you can manhandle and then one that's in the box still. Do thoughts create emotions?
Do thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They do. Yeah.
Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
For me, it's exercise. I have to clear my mind. I can't think straight until I do that.
You mean literally exercise?
Literally exercising. Yes.
Right.
I have
Until
all this energy in my head that I need to just get out in a very meditative, silent, function. And that's hour and a half. And then I feel better.
that is
So,
so cool.
so
That's really good, because McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. Can humans think without language?
yeah, I think there's times we can do that where we're definitely some interplay happening. I can think of some, drug experiences that I've had where I'm definitely communicating with somebody, and it's on a much more kind of instinctual level, kind of like this weird biofeedbacky level.
Yeah.
And I think you're definitely communicating at that point. So I definitely think humans can do that without needing words. Yeah, absolutely.
Chomsky says language is not just words. It's a culture, it's a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. Patrick, what do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
What do I do? That's a good question. I think what I try to do is sort of figure out what the emotion that we're getting at is. If for me, it's like breakdown is always like, okay, we're not something's just not flowing here. So
Yeah.
where is my emotion or this person's emotion that I'm dealing with? Where are they coming from, and how can I figure out a way in? So it's always about me trying to find out what the mode or the mood of the conversation can be, or whatever it is, and then I try to make my entryway based upon that, and then try to just sort of break through the noise at that point, or the lack of or try to find another way to translate it.
Beautiful. Your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I would say I think it's a little bit of both, but I think we are feeling beings predominantly. I think we go by again, this like a very visceral thing. A lot of times the visceral reaction usually comes first for people. um I would say I'm not like that. I'm much more like, I think about things, or I try to keep a mental distance as much as I can on things. And um I think in general, a lot of people aren't attuned to um coping or their emotional intelligence, to where, so it always does become this, a feeling, a very like immediate, like I feel this about this, and but they're not thinking like the why am I feeling this.
Yeah, that's most people answer. I think we're more feeling beings. and Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. I'm like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off?
Yeah.
You know, that's like people who meditate. They go, okay, now think about not thinking.
Yeah.
There's a car on my street with a bumper sticker. It says, don't believe everything you think. And I'm like, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel.
That's true. That's another way to, well, to look at that. You know, I agree with that. But I think, you know, going the meditation thing, it's, you know, I've gotten into that a little bit more over the years and more recently. And it's more that, like, you're not really turning your brain off. Like, everything's running. You're just not interacting with it. So it's just like this, just all these thoughts, whatever they could be, but you're just not choosing not to engage with them. So they're there, but you just have to, I'm just saying, you know, I'm not going to go down this path right now. I don't need to.
That's really well. You're articulate and concise. Thank you. So these are two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Yeah, because it's your personality, what your experience and your past and who you are definitely going to be ones that are going to is how it's going to make all of that you know, relatable. I would say that there isn't, it's kind of like how your mode of communication is going to be from that. So if there is a soul or that sort of thing, it's your personality speaking. So I certainly would agree with that in general.
Beautiful. Then the second Turing question is, can machines think?
No, they can't think. We just give them the prompts to think. But, you know, while they can regurgitate something that, you know, like, let's say we like, you know, ChatGPT, which I've used occasionally for some things. It's kind of like a very advanced, like, Google search. And the interesting thing that I found with it is that, you know, it's not going to give you anything like, you know, extraordinary. It's just going to go through, I'm going to glean through all this stuff that's already been made, and I'm going to give you a little, like, kind of thing that's close to what you want. But if you ask it to, like, you know, what do you feel about something? It's not really trying to create it. It's just going to go through what it knows or what it has access to. But in terms of actually thinking, in terms of a real new creation of ideas, no, it can't do that. It's just regurgitating. And we all do that to, you know, whatever extent that we do, because it's all, you know, the kind of mimesis thing. And we're getting into, like, you know, Rene Girard and the kind of mimetic desire thing, which is very much about that idea of that we, any academics are watching, I'm probably butchering this horribly, but more that, you know, we have our, like, desire to mimic what it is that we see, and then that creates our thoughts. But kind of generally, it really does become that. But only once we play around with other people's ideas, then we add our own baggage to it, then it becomes something new. It becomes something different. So, and in summary, no, machines can't think. They only do, they only think in terms of what we tell them to think.
Really good. I had an epiphany in the middle of your discussion there, because when you use the word glean, I thought of my favorite film, The Gleaners and I.
Yep, that's
and
one of my favorites too.
Yeah, and it's like, and I, AI. And then I love it because T.S. Eliot said auditory imagination, AI. That's when the main thing he did talk about. And then I flip McLuhan's is IA, integral awareness. So how do you can have awareness of integrating these things. Oh, the machine said this and I said this. Now, you know, do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Happiness at this point. I'm finding that meaning is getting I'm finding the world doesn't make sense as much as I've tried to figure that out over the years. I sort of felt I chased my tail around for like 25 years trying to figure that out. And for me now, it's kind of knowing that the world is just kind of insane. And I don't think that it like just became that. I think it's always been that way. It's just we see more of it now. That's what it is. And there's all the nuance of just the or the lack of nuance now, because just everything is thrown at us. So for me, it's kind of trying to find contentment in, you know, how just in what it is that I'm doing and what I'm doing with my time as much as I can. And that's so I'm definitely pursuing happiness at this point.
Interesting, because I got it from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Mhm.
He says happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning does.
Well, I mean, that's to think. I mean, I think I can, you know, I think from my experience, it's that the meaning came through figuring out that, you know, there was not going to be this moment in the world or in my life where it was going to be this complete like harmony, like everything was going to be just kind of like perfect. And I thought that's what I was working towards. But then, of course, finding that out, to me, there's a lot of peace in that meaning to realize that that's never going to be the case. And that's okay.
Yep.
And now it's more going like, okay, well, let me just be happy with my time and the things that I do. And then that will, that'll help what it is that, that'll help my sort of, handling this meaning of insanity, which will obviously change as I get older and, you know, the world changes.
Yeah. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
I would say we're detecting it.
Yeah.
I think, I don't, you know, I think we do actively have to like, we actively have to create things. And I think it's interesting to where yeah, I think it's just being aware of what's there and then you create based upon that. But I think it's definitely, it's definitely like observing, you know. I think that's definitely, how I view it.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I I thought I knew this a bit. I think it actually is the speed of thought, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right. Okay, Audre Lorde said you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Her colleague Yvonne Rainer said, no, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
Oh, God.
And it doesn't have to be a tangible tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really doesn't have to be new.
What new tool would you use? I mean, it's kind of a tough one to say. I think it's if you're finding that, you know, if we're looking at like a new, we say like a new tool, but I think it's more just, you know, it's like you're never going to be like this person or using all of those tools or that sort of thing that this person had. You're never going to quite have that. So you can do that to a certain point. So you obviously can't really use their toolbox. You can kind of like pay homage to it or something like that. But at the end of the day, it's still going to be what you think, you know, how you interpret this, this tool or how you see it. So it's always going to be a thing where you're not going to be able to do that. And if you are, it's just going to be very boring because it's just straight copying. It's not anything. It's not pushing things forward.
Yeah. In fact, that's our commonality in Peter Greenaway. Basically, we'll get into film soon, but the thing he said at a live speaking engagement that just knocked me out. He says, Marty Scorsese ain't doing nothing different than D.W. Griffith. They just filmed plays.
Yeah, I
But,
agree with it.
I know Marty's a great filmmaker, and
Yeah.
I appreciate him. And D.W. Griffith was an incredible filmmaker too, inventing the feature film in America. But I have my qualms with both of them. But that's the problem with cinema, is what you just explained, how you use it. We invented this 130 years ago, and we're still filming plays.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So that's, and that's a lot of problems that I have with contemporary cinema anyway. So
Yeah.
I think it will, we'll get to a little more about Peter Greenaway, but he's certainly one of those guys that, he still is working, and to his own admission, in a cinematic tradition, still in
Oh, yeah.
his way. But I think that, there still is something to be said about the cinematic form that is,
Yeah.
that still hasn't quite been not all the stones have been overturned yet, and I think
Yeah.
it's changing in a positive direction,
Yeah.
artistically.
I'm going to shoot our Greenaway wad. He said, in the history of cinema is only this long,
Mhm.
or tall. In the history of literature is this tall.
Mhm.
Nothing in cinema has come close to Finnegan's Wake.
Mhm.
And it's like, yeah, I loved him saying that, because he is an amazing filmmaker
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, and really, said, let's take, anyways, I'm glad we have that commonality.
Mhm.
So after asking the tool question so often, someone said, well, what about a toy? So then the follow-up is, what new toy do you suggest, or what toy do you gravitate towards?
Yeah, well, but in the cinematic context, the lens that's going to give me the most interesting viewpoint. How's that? I mean,
Wow.
I think that's really what it is, because it's always like, well, how can I look at this thing that to my eyes doesn't actually appear that interesting, but when I put a lens on it, why does it become interesting then?
Yeah.
So what new form or context can I put this in to give this image or idea meaning?
But is that, you're saying that's to be invented, or you already have this option? You go, what lens can I employ right now for this shot? And I have these options. Is it both? You're looking for someone to invent a new lens too, or just the options you have present?
I'm just looking at the options that I have present.
Yeah.
If I have to make something or some kind of a thing to get my point across, I can do that, but usually that's just going to be using a, whatever combination of
Yeah.
things, and then plus, old tricks and things like that to make that work. But no, I like to work with, I do believe in, the old adage that, if for cameras, the best camera is the one you have, so
Yeah.
if I happen just to have my phone on me now, which obviously they're quite powerful these days with what you can get and how good that they're getting on just essentially focal length of lenses with what people sort
Yeah.
of look at, you can get some really extraordinary images and angles that you just couldn't. So it's like, if that's all I've got and that's what I need to use, I'm going to use this, and I'm not going to be ashamed to say that.
Yeah. Beautiful. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Oh God, what do I worry about? So much, so much. But I would say, you know, am I going to be happy the next day?
Yeah.
And is my family going to be happy the next day? Those
Yeah.
are the things I do worry about the most, and making sure that them and myself are as taken care of as we can be.
McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound, the poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. Patrick, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I think because being being an artist sometimes can be it's a very it's very introspective most of the time, and people are very um they're very worried about being too introspective with oneself or being too self-critical.
Yeah.
And if you delve a little deeper into whatever phrases or stories or whatever, like, history that you have, and you create certain kinds of we'll say like a sort of pseudo history around that, then you will realize that sometimes you might have been influenced in a way that was very hurtful or negative, or you've been doing that subconsciously for such a long time. So you're kind of afraid to go that deep into the introspection. And then what you see can be really scary, because it kind of goes, oh, maybe I've been living, you know, not a lie, but maybe there's something else I should have been focusing on. And now I didn't do that for however many years. And that's scary for a lot of people to go that deep into their into what their problems or whatever it is that they're doing might be. It's just it can be unpleasant.
Do artists have moral obligation?
Well, that's kind of the question about, like, well, what exactly are the morals of the artist? It's like, uh, do they have like a moral obligation to, like, I'll just throw out like say the truth or something? I don't know about that, because truth is all subjective to what everybody's experience is and where people are coming from. And I think I don't think that they have any kind of really obligation to anybody, or to be like a moral obligation. I think it's just it's I don't think artists should be obliged to do anything, and I don't think anybody should be obliged to like do anything, in the sense of being in a sense of like, you must, if you're sharing something, you owe it to somebody. And I don't think that's always the case. So I would say no.
I agree. You believe 90% of people go, yeah, everybody has a moral obligation, and they have a moral obligation to their self and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that's what art is, in my opinion. It's supposed to fuck your shit up and make you say, I can do that. And, you're going to break kind of, moral, ethical kind of standards sometimes, maybe. But I just wanted to go off because you anticipated this with your wordage. Mike Kelly said, making art is making your problems other people's problems.
That's true. That's true. Depending on what you make.
Yeah.
A lot of, I mean, particularly this film about John is also a lot about my problems with cinema, not only just about John itself, but also the issues that I have with, the standard, narrative function, or even in documentary function. So
Yeah.
I definitely think that, but I think that those are the most interesting works, where you are dealing with like a person's like whatever baggage that is, and you're trying to figure out, well, what are they going through, and what's this lens that they're giving me to see this through. And like, I'm interested in being in this space with them. So as long as one's open to dealing with that, then it'll be for a fun ride. But if it's not, then people just run away.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you saying that. And so, and people might not know, you're talking about John Jost, Jost. You're making a doc on it, or a hybrid. So here's one more in that regards. Poet Fanny Howe. The point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
That it isn't. That's an interesting contradiction there. And just put there. I don't think I agree with that, but certainly I think art makes life worth living. Seeing new things, seeing new forms of expression, what people are doing, like what just kind of, you see a new image and you can't describe what it's doing for you. It's making you feel something. Sometimes
Yeah.
for me, like the big emotion I like to go through is excitement. Like if I see something, it makes me feel
Yeah.
energized to go out there and make or try to be in this like little, world, the aesthetic world that they've created. And I think that, you know, making that is still living a life, because it's still interpreting what you're seeing, but just on an imaginary level. And can that be, a true to life, portrait drawing, or is it an abstraction, or what is it exactly? But that's what you're seeing, and you're still living life to see your the gaze through that. So
Yeah.
that's how I feel about that.
Great word, gaze. I want to go into that, but I watched is it called I Am Chris Squire?
I am Chris Squire. Yes. Yes.
I was so intrigued by that title.
No.
And watching that film, I was like, oh yeah, I've seen this in Ann Arbor for 30 years,
Yep.
but it held me for,
good.
what is it, 4 minutes long?
It's about 4 minutes. Yeah.
It held me so good, because I knew, is there any moment I'm going to hear that great bass line?
Yeah.
And no, but I heard this faint kind of yes quote, but it was so vague that it helped me be more involved in watching the film. in the visuals
Yep.
were so, like, dreamy, and then the titles you threw up there. I mean, to me, it was just like, that's what I want in a short experimental film.
Yep.
I want that. It like delivered all the goods, because I'm really kind of jaded after watching experimental films for 50 years. It's like, oh no, here we go.
Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed that. And
Yeah.
it was that was kind of an experiment, and trying to see how I had filmed some stuff from a live Yes show from '91, straight off the screen with one of my older cameras, and I really mucked up a lot of like Yes samples and things like that, and on the audio side, and it was kind of like, it says I want to be on stage in sequins, and it's sort of like looking at that the kind of like being up on stage and performing, and you're in these like kind of get-ups, and you're creating this whole sort of world. And the idea was that this is kind of like the viewer's imagination when you're sort of going through that hyper kind of dream state, almost, of like, whoa, this is what it's gonna like feel like. And it's not, it's all this kind of this kind of this mix and miasma of stuff. So I'm glad you enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah. And do you know this author? He's kind of famous, Michael Chabon.
Yeah, I know. I haven't read his work, but I know who he is. Yeah.
He memorized every Yes lyric. He's a Joycean too, and took him 20 years to admit that The Wake was worth reading. But it was very, very fun, because yes, you got to kind of blame Yes for punk, because that's what they were revolting against. No more ELP or Yes, we want just raw. So, are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Old ideas. I'm always excited about what we're going to come up with next. Like I'm not nostalgic like at all for much of anything. And it's really about like, once the past is over, it's done. So I've just got to embrace the new stuff. And I always want to see like any filmmaker until like the day they drop. Like I want to see like their newest thing. Like what are they trying to do? And that's always the big thing. It's like, well, they might do something extraordinary. And it's like, best example of that was, I believe, Sidney Lumet's second to last film, which was Before the Devil Knows You're Dead. I thought that was one of the best things he ever did. And I was like, well, shit. Because usually, you kind of like, 85, and they're kind of at about their, Usually they're peak or they're repeating themselves. But I thought like, no, that was one of the best things he's ever done for his career. So I think Tarantino's full of shit where he says that filmmakers become irrelevant after 65. He's the one putting the restraints on himself for that.
Yeah. No, he's full of, in many ways. No, anyways, but I love Sidney Lumet saying,
Yeah.
cinema can't do diddly squat, but it ain't going to keep me from trying.
Yeah.
You know, and he really tried, and he really accomplished something. But it also reminded me of Kurosawa said, this was in the New York Times obit when he died. He said he wants to die on the set and go, cut, boom, and fall over dead after he says cut. That to me is like dedicated. Okay, so can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
Yeah, I can conjure up my earliest memory. I'm unclear how old I am. I'm going to guess probably below 3. So maybe let's say 2.5. I remember my mom and my sister coming into my room, and my sister's still quite young, so she's like standing next to my mom because my sister's only a year and a half older than me, and it was my mom waking me up and taking me out of my crib when I'm a little baby. So again, I'm gonna guess because I started having memories when I'm about 4, like active memories at that point, but that's the earliest one I can think of, and I would say that's and so I'm probably below 3 at that point.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Depends how you look at it. For my own experience, it's been a bit of a curse because I remember too many things, and I remember too much of the nuances of what people did or didn't do, or what they said or didn't say, or how I took it. And then that has led to some resentment over time with people, situations, things that I have had to get over because I might remember it as clear as day, but they don't. And you have to just, and I've had to learn how to just actively let that go. So there are times where there are certain moments in my life or certain periods that I wish I didn't remember as well, but you know, that's just how my mind works.
Yeah. I appreciate you being honest, Patrick, and concise and articulate, because 90% of people go, it's a blessing. And then they'll go, well, it could be a curse. They want to answer fast because there's no speed here. You can sit and think for 20 minutes and, So tell me someone within your immediate family who had an impact on you, and what specifically was that impact?
Well, are you talking in general or like artistically?
You put it in the context you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you 2.
Good.
So my certainly my mother's always been very crafty, very handy. She still does that to this day. She's a really good artist. She paints, knits, does all this stuff. Just always likes doing that kind of like gardening, all that stuff. So I think she definitely gave me that kind of idea to be able to see stuff in an artistic way. She never really guided me how to do that stuff, but more seeing her by osmosis, like how to do, like, that just you can create just for the scent because it feels good. And she's been doing that her whole life. And I've always enjoyed that a lot. And by kind of a weird, like, moment, like for example, like my father introduced me to the sport of ice hockey in 1993 when I went to my first game, and I've been following that game and one team, the Tampa Bay Lightning, religiously ever since. So 32 years. And what was interesting about that was that I'm like a really big researcher. So, I have encyclopedic film knowledge. I have an encyclic, I have an encyclopedic knowledge about, ice hockey and anatomy, a lot of these other things that I just sort of go down the rabbit holes on. I'm just kind of obsessive about that. And I learned that just recently, my father shared a lot of those traits. Um, and to get back to the influence of that, it was, once I got into ice hockey, I then started to see like players' last names and they're from all these kind of weird places and stuff like that. And it really got me just looking into like world cultures, like all over, and just really like going down the rabbit hole of those things and just, researching about, languages and, cities, and just kind of giving me like a much bigger worldview at that point. And this is kind of early stages of the internet, and I'm a young kid at this time, but it just always, being an experience like that, like kind of weirdly was a catapult to just like research stuff like, endlessly, or just be fascinated by these like little worlds and subworlds. So I think that was one of the impetuses that got me into it.
That was cool. My brother's total hockey guy in Detroit, Michigan, and it's been for 50, 60 years playing and following. And we both love the line in a Frank Zappa song. He goes, "Any sport with a puck has got to be about the best." And it's funny because Frank was not a sports guy, but there he gives a plug for hockey right in the middle of a song. So very good, Patrick. Same question outside your immediate family. Someone who had an impact on you, and what was that impact?
My dear friend, departed, Terry Porter. He was a guy who I worked with in Sarasota, Florida, where I'm from, a video store that was around for forever, closed in 2019, called Video Renaissance. And he was a really interesting guy, super talented musician. He got me into a lot of electronic music and ambient music, and, really like got me into sort of like this kind of subcultures of like, weird, particularly music, and, not the film stuff. I kind of found my way on that, like, on my own, but he certainly like would just allow me to see this like other world of, just like, other like artists and weirdos and all this kind of stuff. And he was just one of my absolute best friends. And, he's a guy who I miss to this day. And he was a total huge influence. He's been June 1st. He's been gone for 15 years now, but he's a guy I still think about every day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really beautiful that you can recall him that well. And I got a picture of him, that was beautiful. So did your parents raise you a particular religion?
No. My mom was not really brought up anything. Her parents, I guess, were Southern Baptist, but not much. My dad was brought up Presbyterian, and then he found God again in like the mid 90s after my parents divorced and some other things. And then he was born again for the rest of his life, but I had no real interest in it. So everything that I've sort of looked at spiritually has just come from an intellectual level, but there's no, I don't have a religious spiritual side in any way.
Do you pray?
No.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Why did you have to make things so difficult?
You want God to ask you that? That is heavy.
Yeah. Oh wait. I'm sorry. You what God? What
no,
I want to ask God?
It was. What do you want Him to say to you? You answered that. You were saying what you were going to say to Him.
Oh,
yeah.
Well,
or no, I don't mean to say Him. Just say God. Whatever.
Right. But
what would you like God to say to you? After you die?
That was a challenge. I gave you, and I hope this is a just reward. whatever that is,
Well, the joke is the guy gets to heaven, and Saint Pete is standing there at the gates, and he looks in and he goes, "You have Zoom in heaven?" And Saint Pete goes, "That's all we got." Now you can flip it to hell, the same thing.
Yeah.
You got Zoom in hell? Yeah, that's all we got. Okay, so do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
I would say evil uses people to exist. I'm a believer that we're all born a blank slate, and
Yeah.
it really is just you're a product of your environment.
Yeah.
And I think anybody is capable of doing the worst possible things to anybody else, but it just has to be in the context.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody is necessarily born evil or anything like that. I think it's just truly a product of circumstance.
The real hidden question, Patrick, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Mm-hmm.
JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I don't think you empower them necessarily, but I do think if you're not at a stage where you feel comfortable, then you are certainly empowering them. If your enemy has hurt you, and I guess we could kind of say in that context that we're talking about, then this person has hurt you. But I would say that if you acknowledge them, it's not necessarily that it'll give them power, but it'll just sometimes make you go, depending on what stage you're in. Let's say if you're at the end stage, it's more that this is what this person has done. This is who they are, still could be, but this is who they are. And let me just be aware of that. So I don't make that mistake again or run into that thing again.
Yeah. And again, it's like Nassim Taleb said, games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is.
Yeah.
And Gregory Bateson says, when a criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff? Or does he go, oh, I did something morally and socially wrong? So again, it's a lot of prompts. Basic question is, does punishment work?
Well, punishment the way we do it in the United States doesn't work. But I mean, I would say obviously depending on what you've done, everybody needs a big timeout, that sort of thing. That's one thing. But then it's more looking at okay, well, why did you do that? And then it's figuring out the why, and then seeing if that person has the inner ability to be able to reform from that. I think everyone theoretically is capable of that. Whether they actually can or not, of course, is another thing. But I definitely think that there should always be attempts at trying to reform somebody of past behavior. But that doesn't mean that one has to either forgive or forget or whatever. But it just means that it has to. You have to understand what it is and just move through it and move on from it.
Yeah. That's good. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
we live life anyway, but I think sometimes like we are everybody's like a natural storyteller, you know? And so I think when we do that, it's the idea that this is sort of I want you to see this story through this lens. And what does that like, maybe, to say that it's like, it teaches us something, that's as kind of the peak of what what we try to get to. But I would say it's definitely because there's an experience that you want to share that is kind of indescribable at times, and it has to be done under the guise of artifice to make it real, or have a staying power. Because we can do everything that we do in cinema, walking down the street, whatever, but is it interesting just for us to walk out down the street, or is it interesting to see it with something attached to it? And I think sometimes it can be more interesting to see it under a different viewpoint than what we have, right here with our eyes.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, walk us through, where's your tipping point to say, I want to be a filmmaker? Were your parents taking you to the big cinema, or were you watching cable, VHS, DVDs? And where did you go, oh, I want to do that? Like, and then walk us through, what'd you study in high school and college? Was that?
Well, as much as I remember, to start, like, where the kind of cinema bug got me, I definitely remember, always watching stuff, when I was a kid. Like, I remember enjoying like Batman serials of the 40s. Those were a lot of fun. And I really liked old Universal horror films and monster movies, and really got into Godzilla when I was a kid, and adore that. So it was like, they would take me to, the big movies and things like that. And, I wouldn't say I had like an art house experience in that, that until I was older. My parents weren't particularly, interested in that kind of stuff. And, I, remember going to, the Blockbuster videos and all these sorts of things to get that kind of stuff. But I remember, but I was very lucky with where I grew up at the video store I worked at, and off and on for about 7 years in the mid 2000s ago, Video Renaissance in Sarasota, Florida, which was around from 85 to 2019. And shout out to its owner, Bill Woldridge, who just an obsessive collector guy. And, at the peak had like 57,000 titles, and just like everything you could imagine, from, old Hollywood stuff, as much foreign as you could imagine, just all weird little things. Right. And that really got me into like being like, whoa, there's this whole like other world like going there. And it started in dribs and drabs in terms of like, I would watch like, like Japanese films or anime stuff when I was 10, 11 years old, but with like subtitles, not dubbed. So, and I was lucky because my great grandmother was deaf, so she had closed captioning before it was a standard thing. And so I was used to having that. So, the subtitle reading has never been a problem for me. And I remember telling somebody when I was 11 that I wanted to be a director, and I just kind of never got off of that boat, and just kind of going into filmmaking. And there were other times where I thought I was going to go into different like sides of it. I thought I was just going to do like audio mixing, or, kind of some of the vocational things of it. But then it really hit me that it's like, this is kind of the vocation that you've always been moving towards. So this is what you should do. So that was just, it's that impetus has always been there, just to create something in, moving images.
Did you start making films in grade school or high school, and on what format? Or did you just go, I'm going to the new school and do start making films there?
No, I started making stuff. I first started shooting in DV. So I started shooting stuff around 90, 98, 99.
Yeah.
That was my first, like, so I had a mini DV camera and kind of making things from there. And, was always interested in like really experimenting with like what I had, like just in like what can you do with like Zoom stuff, and like how can you just like fuck around with an image like as best as you can. And that's always was really exciting to me. So I made little things, nothing I would call like a scripted film or anything like that, like growing up through like middle school and then through the high school years and things like that. But I would say like once I then started, and then I didn't really shoot anything too much until my early 20s again. I was always big into photography. I'm quite an avid photographer. So that kind of became my kind of outlet of that for a while on the image side. And then when I got my first it's the I can't remember the name, but it was a kind of a Canon Handycam, but it was with but it was with a but it wasn't with mini DV tape. It was with the SD cards. And that was like the first time where I really started to like experiment with it. In this is around 04, 05. So that's where I was like, okay, now we're really like trying to do something of that like aesthetic at that time, which was sort of a video-y-ish kind of thing. And then it made me realize that there was a, that being able to create that was a possibility.
Was the new school in New York hard to get into, and what was your takeaway from it?
No, I didn't think it was. No, it wasn't hard at all. So I kind of had a bit of a sidetrack with my career was a little strange because I was in the health field before I got into the world of filmmaking. I was a massage therapist and a personal trainer, and I did that more under the guise of like trying to get myself into something stable, because I always knew I wanted to have a creative life and that sort of thing. And then I decided that I was going to go to like regular college. And then I went to a community college in Florida, and then I transferred to the new school. They were the one and only school that I applied for. And it got in. It was easy, and they were super great. I enjoyed being there a lot because, and I didn't have a very good experience in school growing up. And even in like the first of like, community college, still this very kind of rigid system. But the new school gave me so much freedom that I didn't know I had until kind of almost at the end of my time there. So it was great in terms of like, they were like, well, if that's what you want to do, just go ahead and do it. We're not going to stop you. And I was expecting to be stopped, but you could kind of do anything you want.
Wow. That's really good, because a screenwriting teacher told me great film or great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. When you're making a Patrick film, it's not a commission. You're not for hire. You're making something exclusively Patrick Miller. Mm-hmm. What role does intention play in your creative process?
I'm thinking like sometimes, how, digestible is this going to be? I am thinking like, I can very easily go into, self-indulgence mode and do really, just, very, very out there things and all that stuff. And that's kind of cool. But at the end of the day, I also, if I'm sharing this with people, I do want to try to communicate with them on some level, no matter how abstractly it might be. So what I try to really do, particularly as I'm editing, is that I'm watching it and I'm going like, okay, is this satisfying me as a viewer? Not that like, oh, I need to make this so it will conform to X, Y, and Z. It's more like, do I like this as a viewer?
Yeah.
Does this do something for me? And that's where I try to look at it. And if I like it, then that's all that matters.
That's funny because the next question you answered, but if you want to elaborate, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your viewer when you're making your film?
I'm thinking of where it will end up eventually. But in terms of my own work, I'm not thinking about like I'm not trying to think about like what the things down the line are going to be like. How much money am I going to make from this? How much is this going to do all the, springboardy things? I'm not thinking about that, or kind of like rewards or accolades or whatever, because I I realized that like after a while, like whatever thought, work, and completion you put into it, that's 50% of the process. And then what people are going to bring to it afterwards. And I noticed this after I started showing stuff, and it was like, oh, okay, this is stuff that like I didn't see this. I don't quite think it's there, but let me think about that. And sometimes people's thoughts and opinions have like kind of colored my own viewing of the work, where it's like, oh, maybe that was there and I just wasn't seeing it. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I try not to think about that as much as I can, so I can at least artistically complete what I want to complete. But I do still want to try to go in with the idea that I'm going to communicate with somebody.
Yeah, that's good. McLuhan says that there's no such thing as a good or a bad movie. It's a good or a bad viewing experience. Any comment?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think like, there's, the shittiest films you could think of, right? I come from a bit of a culture, I enjoyed like Mystery Science Theater 3000 growing up, and I enjoyed like, schlock kind of campy stuff,
Yeah.
and in small doses, but there are certain times where like you're enjoying the ineptness of like whatever the film happens to be, and it's okay that it's not like good, which is all
Yeah.
subjective anyway, but
Yeah.
more that it's a like it's like I'm having a great time watching this like shitty movie, and that's okay. So it really is about the experience, like in and of itself, because like, like films that are meant to be highfalutin and that sort of thing, like, or are critically, have critical accolades or whatever, I can turn them off after 10-15 minutes, because it's like, well, it's not grabbing me, it's not doing anything for me. So like, if I'm not feeling that, if the filmmaker doesn't make me feel like there's something there, then it's fine to give up on it. But yeah, I think it's not about a film being good or bad, but more of just the experience of it. Definitely.
Yeah. That's I'm glad you brought that up, because Timmy Burton made a film on supposedly the worst filmmaker in the world, Ed Wood.
Oh, Ed Wood, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've shown Ed Wood's films and people love it and they have a great time.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of Oscar Wilde saying, bad poetry can spring from genuine feelings.
Mhm.
So, I mean, Ed Wood thought he was making great films, and all the power to him.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, Plan 9, when I saw it, was hilarious, and you know, it was so entertaining, and I love Glenn or Glinda. I think that's just like,
Oh
yeah.
God, yes.
And it's interesting that Tim Burton goes in that way, because I'm not a big fan of Tim Burton's movies,
Yeah,
but I think Ed Wood's the best thing he's ever done, and it's
yeah.
just like it's just a fabulous movie. It's a movie I could watch. You could put on right now. I'll watch it beginning to end. You know.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he had Corla Pandit in it. Do you know this organ player? Because you know ambient electronic music.
Mhm.
Yeah. Corla Pandit, Korla Pandit. He played organ on TV in the 50s. Look
Mhm.
him up.
Yeah.
He basically disguised himself as an Indian wearing a turban, playing exotica or bachelor pad, you know, like cocktail music on the Hammond B organ.
Mhm.
But he wasn't. He was a black man. So for 6 decades, he basically disguised himself.
No kidding. Wow. No, I never heard of
Oh
that.
no, you got to look him up. He's
Yeah.
intriguing. Zappa wrote a whole song about him. Corla Pandit, unbelievable character, and the fact that Timmy gave him a job and said, "Here, play yourself in that movie." You know. So McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, like knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera extends our eyelid, or a projector. Even say non-tangible, say philosophy or religion might extend consciousness. What does the movie camera extend for you? Whether it's, I mean, the moving image camera, whether it's film or video, what humanness does it extend for you?
Certainly extends emotion. I think, like with whatever I'm always trying to do with either be a still photo or whatever I'm trying to grab, right? I always want that image to tell a story of some kind, and I'm always trying to find what that is. So I think it extends emotion, because
Yeah.
we exert stuff through, you know, we exert, and you know, we like see that, and I think we see that on camera when when we see particularly movement, not so much of the subject, but I think the camera sometimes, and I think that like can really color that can color like a context in a really nice way, because if the camera is kind of moving in an interesting way, what's this interplay that's happening between subject, and subject can just be like insert whatever it is, you know, plant, human, whatever, and the person behind the camera itself. And I think it's trying to extend the emotional connection between the two.
Really good, Patrick. I got to tell you, a lot of people say memory, sight. There's many answers and there's no right or wrong answer, but I love McLuhan said the camera extends, movies extend your foot because you're traveling.
On a practical level, that is entirely true. Yes.
But now to our man, Peter Greenaway, he said,
Yeah.
cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. So are experimental filmmakers telling stories a different way or doing something completely different? You know, me and you could watch Tony Conrad's The Flicker, black and white frames just flickering on and off. We could have a story go through our head while we're watching it. But in essence, it's not storytelling per se, as we think a traditional narrative. What do you think of this line by Peter? Cinema's much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers.
Uh, I mean, knowing a lot of Peter Greenaway's quotes and kind of how he says that, I agree with him that there are a lot of really fascinating ways that we can work with the moving image that isn't like, you know, a standard narrative arc and that sort of thing. And I think that's why I particularly like, you know, documentary and hybrid documentaries, because you can play with the form so radically, and like the video essay form is probably, or the film essay is probably my favorite genre, I guess you could say, of film, currently, like the, Chris Marker, John Jost films, particularly, Speaking Directly, and Plain Talk and Common Sense. I think that when you were, because for him, for Peter Greenaway, he said, the biggest thing he always wanted out of painting was put a soundtrack under them. And it's like, yeah, you can add so much by giving all of these different elements from different mediums into one thing. And so I do think that there are ways that we can move cinema forward and do things that a traditional like story, to me at this point, is not going to be, I'm not going to find anything new or profound in it. I'm just going to find a lot of like, like big Hollywood stuff. It's derivative of forms that were done, 50, 60, 70 years ago. But it's just now like, well, how do we play around with what it means to be with the screen, or, in that context. So yeah, I would agree with him on that.
But, Andrew Noren said, interesting, if you put one frame next to another frame, that is narrative, that is storytelling, whether it's abstract or a film of a drama happening. Because, like I said earlier, Peter said, Marty's not doing anything that D.W. Griffith didn't do. He's just filming plays. But one experimental filmmaker, Hollis Frampton, said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. So I added the question, can you forget to die?
Can you forget to die? I don't know if you can forget to die. I mean, well, depending on how distracted you are, particularly in our day and age, walking down the street, and then, car hits you, boom, that's it. You've kind of forgot to die gracefully. But, I think like thinking about, going back of like, if you put any frame next to each other and then boom, you have a story, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if necessarily that, like, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about when it comes to story, right? It's sort of like for me, it's like, I'm not really like watching cinema these days for like plot or these kind of things. I'm not really looking for it for that. I'm looking for it for like what it's doing on a very sometimes on a very technical level, sometimes on a very like emotional level, with like like with the, referring to Paul Schrader's book, Transcendental Style and Film, the notion of what I realized that I, as a film viewer, am always looking for is a moment of transcendentness in film. Now, whatever the context of that film, whatever the, however that film was presented, like whatever, but that's what I'm looking for in that. So I think that, the story is sort of like whatever it is that we make up. I think the story is the feeling of the journey that we go on, to sort of surmise that, I guess you could say.
Very interesting, because, Schrader wrote one of the longest he wrote the longest article in Film Comment magazine ever. And it's the Film Canon article he wrote. It's amazing. And he mentions McLuhan in that. And I was always impressed by that. And the thing about can you forget to die is most people don't know if I'm asking literally or metaphorically. And like I say, you put the questions into the context you want. So the flip is that Marshall said that all words are metaphoric. So then what is the word literal a metaphor for?
That's a good question.
And I love that you brought up the word screen, because I love that story where Ken Jacobs and Stan Brakhage walked up to the screen at a big movie theater and went right up to the edge and looked at it that way. And the security guard goes, "No, you can't look at it that way." It's like, well, why not? I'm trying to get, we all are in these little, reality tunnels. We have to watch it a certain way. But, bringing up storytelling and narrative, I'm curious. One gentleman I interviewed recently said, and he was a writer, he said that he was told narrative doesn't lie and storytelling is something different. Do you see any sort of difference between narrative and storytelling, or can you articulate any ideas in that regard? Because is it true that narrative doesn't lie?
Well, I would say narrative doesn't narrative doesn't lie if you're just talking about it in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
I think storytelling is a lot more is a lot more broken up, because you can have a story that's really that's really long and has a lot of tangents and a lot of this and that over and back, or you have a story that's very short and concise and it's just like, this happened here, but a narrative is sort of trying to set the stage of where we are, and I'm going to guide you through this world that I've kind of created. So it's not going to lie to you because it already knows its end destination. I think storytelling doesn't quite know that, because storytelling is a little more loose.
Yeah. Beautiful. This is Milan Kundera, the guy who wrote Unbearable Likeness of Being. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can. It's like, yeah, right. I take a pen and I write a character on a piece of paper. How can the character go further than the piece of paper? So, I mean, is that what you were touching on just then, the difference?
No. I was talking about where he's talking about, and I like Kundera a lot. Where he's talking about, that the character can go so much farther than him. He's allowing himself to get into whatever his, desires and fantasies, fears, all this stuff are, and, the actual containment, particularly in writing, because it's all your imagination. So it's the page is kind of just immaterial. That just happens to be the holder, or the medium in which it's through. And shall we say, using narrative in a film context, a narrative is only what the containment of it is within a film. But I wouldn't say that it's beyond the page. I wouldn't say it's getting beyond the page, but it's more where is the idea going? And that's where it's more exciting, because then it becomes open-ended.
If me and you were starting the Ann Arbor Film Festival over 60 years ago, would you want it to be more inclusive or exclusive? And keep in mind that it's always had animations and documentaries, but it's mainly experimental films. I asked Chick Strand about this. She was starting Canyon Cinema at the same time with Bruce Bailey in San Francisco. And she said, well, we're trying to recreate our 11-cent movie-going experience. So we'd show a newsreel, a cartoon, and then an experimental film. Brackage came along and says, don't show that other stuff, just show experimental films. So basically, should it be more inclusive or exclusive if as a, curator?
As a curator, well, if we're talking about, or if we're talking about getting it started now in the context, then I definitely think it should be inclusive. And I still think even when it was first starting, I still think it should be inclusive for all different types of style of filmmaking that you're trying to make. And I think one does not really supersede the other. in terms of like, a genre of these, like this has more than this or whatever, right? It's just what you happen to be interested in, like on a practical level. I wish I cared more about, Hollywood stuff and, kind of more mainstream kind of poppy things. Cause it's certainly like work wise, I would be able to go into that stuff like, genuinely and wholeheartedly, but I don't. Most of the stuff that I work on, for, to make a living, as an editor and also as a post supervisor, I don't like very much of it. It's not really anything I would search out, but it's always something that is going to inform all of the other forms. And you can take a very generic form and turn it on its head by just doing like, you have all these things here. Well, let's turn that one this way, that one this way.
Yeah.
And you've automatically made something new. So it shouldn't be exclusive to the point where it has to be this way or it has to be that way, because then you're losing the sense of playfulness of creation.
Yeah, really good. Because I was on the screening committee in Ann Arbor 45, almost 50 years ago, and there were 8 members, and we all gave Gus Van Zant's short 0. It didn't get in. And then when we saw Drugstore Cowboy, we're like, this guy's like sneaking experimental film shit in his mainstream film,
Yeah.
So it is interesting because, what are the services and disservices of ghettoizing or marginalizing experimental film? Jackson Pollock was on the cover of Life magazine in 49, and regular folks could start developing an aesthetic on experimental painting. There were no Bruce Connors or Maya Deren Life magazine covers. So generally it's privileged or entitled, I call them rich art kids, who develop an avant-garde aesthetic and dominate experimental film world. Any comment?
No, that's true. I agree with that. As I said, if I wish I came from a bit of money, and so I could just kind of go into that. But it's like I have to be a little smarter about it, because the stuff I make, I'm not thinking about commercial potential for it. I'm not thinking about that stuff. I'm thinking about, what it's going to do. Like even this, this film I've been making about John for 3 years, I'm not thinking about it in terms of like, who's going to pick it up, who's going to sell it, who's going to do this and that to it. I'm not interested in that. Like if I have to distribute the thing by myself, I'll do it by myself. It's not a problem. It's more that like, I do think that some people, when they do have a certain amount of privilege or the means to privilege, can dominate, certain things that would seem a little like out there at one point, kind of like kids with bands these days and that sort of thing. It's as opposed to, living when New York was a shithole in the, in the 70s. And, then you could live, where things were happening cheap, but it doesn't work that way anymore. So it's kind of like, it is getting more towards like, only like, rich kids are going into comedy and that sort of thing. Cause doing those things, like they don't quite have the payback or the ability to sustain themselves. But that's not the art's fault. That's just society. That's not the art's fault. The art doesn't know that stuff. The art doesn't care about that. But the people who would be more interested in, kind of being, experimental, or we could use the term self-indulgent or whatever in their work, are ones that don't have to really think about the practicalities. And I think that's the biggest difference. So I think that's the only real change from it, is just that and even so, the means to make films and really high quality and really good films are within the reach of your average consumer these days, or prosumer, I guess you could say. But, where does one make a living from that? And that's always the question that everybody's asking.
Yeah. Not my, That's like festival specific. You know, people make films specifically for a festival or for Netflix. You know, they make them, and so that's true. You're being true to your vision in the John Jost. I appreciate that. I spoke with Michael Apted 45 years ago, and I said, "Why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast?" And most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it flourished in the 80s with MTV to the point where Marty Scorsese said, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So Michael Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. So I asked this question with a bias, Patrick, can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
No, we're just brainwashed to believe that. I have a bit of an ability from, working in kind of fast turnaround TV shows to be able to, watch dailies at double time and grab stuff and that whole sort of thing. Right. But I still have to go back to it and then watch it in real time to see if it's going to actually work or not. Like I can't do, it's like we just kind of have this thought, that because just everything, because we can have all these different experiences. And so it's the kind of thing where I say, I'm not very good at multitasking because, it's like, well, you're going to get like a tenth of me for this, and all that stuff. So no, I don't think we can. And at the end of the day, we still have to think about and really digest what's actually happening. It's not like we're any faster to do it. It's just people expect a more jumpy, editing style, I guess, depending on the context. Because I think I read an article ages ago about Alien, the original Alien, is cut in a fairly shorter style. Like the shots are held a little bit longer. The pace is kind of a little bit slower, and you wouldn't think that for a Hollywood film. And then obviously that's changed over the years, particularly how Ridley Scott cuts things now. It's like, but he's just doing that because I think he's trying to outrun his mortality. I think it's really just the times have sped up, but our ability to understand information hasn't.
Wow. Because is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
No, absolutely not. I can't. No, I've been trying to do that for 25 years. I can't do it. And I finally threw in the towel. I said, fuck it. I can't do this. I'm going to do the best I can on this, do the best I can on this, but I can only do it one at a time. And if I think about the other things, I just get overwhelmed, and it allows me to not live in the moment,
Yeah. It's funny because what you said too there a second ago, I saw D.A. Pennebaker at UCLA, talking to a bunch of film students once, and he goes, never fast forward through your footage, you got to watch it, all of it. And it's like, come on. And, you learned how to develop that, and you explained it well. You fast forward, then you zoom in, but it is, monotonous as hell if you got to watch every footage, because you might miss that tiny little subtle thing that scoots by. And the other thing you brought up was exactly what James Joyce said in Finnegan's Wake. Are my consumers not my producers? And so keeping that in mind, we're almost there at the 90-minute point, Patrick, and I'd love to do a part 2 because I think we could really get into the essay film. I rarely have people who are so versed in essay film, and especially you using the word hybrid. And I would love to go into Schrader more and the human gaze. That's one thing that I've been probing a lot because John Berger sort of first started talking about that, the human gaze. And then you might know Nina Menken's film, The Female Gaze. And then, there's all kinds of that going around. And then I love to get into the framing aesthetic, because, I asked Bruce Bailey, where did you get your framing aesthetic? And that's, questions we could probe in a part 2, and it can be like half a year down the line. No hurry. But I really appreciate your time and energy here. I really learned a lot. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for inviting me, Jerry. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And we'll plan it down the road. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, now I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Yeah, no, it's great. I really, this was a real treat for me, and I really enjoyed, talking about some stuff I don't get to talk about too often, and hopefully, people watching enjoy what I have to say about the sort of philosophical notions of seeing, and it's a very rich world, and it's a very contradictory world.
Yeah. And even though I flubbed on the titles, but we'll have your website listed and people can go to your Vimeo page and watch some of your films. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.